Morning. It's nice to see lots of recognisable faces and some not so well known to me, but should get to know them. I was eavesdropping on Alison before I came in, and do I need to use the mic? Joan? No, it doesn't. And was listening to her transdisciplinary, really sustainable healthcare, and indeed sustainable health systems is probably one of the big wicked problems. How do we actually make them sustainable? These are intensely complex systems which are not overly known for their willingness to transform and change. They're about power, they're about money, they're about expectation. So it's against all of that that I'll talk a little bit about what sustainable healthcare could be. No doubt as this week has gone on, you've heard these messages, and they're ones that are hopefully not unfamiliar to you now. Around climate change, it is absolutely, in my view, the wicked problem that we all have to try and address in some way. And health systems and healthcare are in it very intimately linked in all of this, as are our daily lives. And you'll see that Howard Frumpkin from University of Washington, where Andy's from as well, I believe he's your dean, and he said very clearly that climate change will affect most populations in coming decades and put all the lives and well-beings of billions of people at increased risk is not under debate. From Glasgow, Phil Hanlon and Margaret Carlyle are saying that at worst we could face social, economic and ecological collapse. And they argue that from a slightly different viewpoint with using varying factors. But they talk a lot about the impact of peak oil production, which as you know, our reliance on fossil fuels is enormous. And they're saying that we're coming to a point where we can't keep being reliant on these. And yet there is such an enmeshing of power and money and indeed social stability around fossil fuels. We only have to look at the Middle East and some of when the oil prices change, when the ability to employ, those whole social systems which are in quite a lot of dissonance have enormous problems. So they're quite clear that this whole age of modernity and our reliance on fossil fuels is coming to an end, and we need to think differently. And finally, this year, Fine and colleagues in The Lancet said very clearly that climate change is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, problem facing our species as human beings. So all of that is against a backdrop where we provide healthcare systems and provide healthcare, where we value healthcare, or at least illness care. And I'll be quite clear about that. We value illness care. I'm not sure we value healthcare at all. So that's the sort of backdrop. So what is sustainability in healthcare? I'm going to try and say that it's lots of things to lots of different people. And there is some work being done in it, but this is absolutely an emerging field. It's an emerging field of research. Yay! So, you know, sorry, that was my own bias coming out there. So there are some very definite things around that. So we'll go through that a bit. I'm very happy to say that I'm very influenced by the work of people like David Pension and Phil Hanlon, both of whom I know. I was lucky enough this year to go to Cambridge and undertake the Leadership and Sustainability program with David. And he's very clear that sustainability is much more than lasting or surviving. It's about designing and delivering healthcare that uses resources in ways that don't prejudice future health and well-being. It's a wonderful statement and really does set the scene as to what sustainable healthcare is about. But when you start to break that down, it becomes intensely complex. Especially designing and delivering healthcare. That means change. It means change in how you work. It means change in how you view things. It may require political change, and that's enormously difficult to influence in some ways. Not prejudicing future health. Well, what will that mean? What do you mean? We don't quite get that. And well-being, what is well-being? Large concepts, easy things to say. Best way is to think about it, we have to break it into small bits, and I'll talk about some of the bits a little bit. So if we're thinking about the whole ecological impact on healthcare delivery, it's only one part of a vision of a truly holistic and sustainable system of prevention, cure and care. And for me that brings me back to the whole sense of what is health? What is it? What is health for us as individuals? What is health for us in communities? What is health for us in terms of the planet? What do we view it as? Is it the way we're chugging along now? Feeling very noble because, you know, I grow my own veggies, I have 2 worm farms, I'm okay. You know, I use my low voltage light bulbs. I occasionally try and cycle, although badly, and get laughed at by small children. You know, all of those things, you know, but hey, you know, you try all of those things. So, you know, each of us try to contribute and do small bits. But what is health? Many of you who've done public health, I hope, would tell me what the definition of health is. How would you define health? Please don't tell me after all these years you can't.
Free of disease.
Absence of disease, yeah. Social and emotional well-being. And that's long been a sort of view of that. But in the face of this wicked problem of climate change, we probably need to start thinking much more about what health is and how we view it. And recently there's been a debate in the BMJ about it. And they're saying that health should really be about the ability to adapt and self-manage in the face of social, physical and emotional challenges. And the reason for that is that they're saying that if we are in the light of climate change, in that whole sense of having health care, that we have increased expectations, increasing costs because of our expectations for curative medicine, an expectation that no matter where we are we can access health care, then there is a responsibility, if you like, that we have to, as individuals, begin to look at our adaptation and our self-management. So that's quite a shift from saying it's about the absence of disease and emotional and physical well-being. So, about adaptation. How can we adapt our lifestyles? How can we adapt our expectations of healthcare? How can we self-manage? Now that's a very important comment in terms of what some people describe as the tsunami of chronic disease. How do we self-manage that disease process? How do we encourage others to do it? How do we prevent them getting there at the same time? So those are some of the things around what we should be thinking around in terms of that. So a different way of saying what is health? It's a movement to try and bring that into a much more about adapting and mitigating how we live. Why is it important? Well, I thought it was good to put up some of this around in terms of energy use in healthcare. I personally think it's incredibly ironic that healthcare is second only to fast food in the US as the most energy intensive industry. The fact they're so interrelated is also quite ironic. And in England, Naylor and Appleby in their commentary in King's Fund review of healthcare and carbon impact of healthcare, noted that healthcare in the UK, the carbon dioxide emissions attributable to the NHS are alone greater than the total emissions from all aircraft departing from Heathrow Airport. Heathrow being, I think, the second busiest terminal in the world. So the footprint of NHS England, I say that as a Scot very clearly, the footprint of NHS England is enormous in terms of carbon. And in the US, utterly phenomenal. So carbon emission, we know that's a really energy dense, again brings us back to the fuels and all of those things that we use, but also a whole lot of our processing. How do you change that? What can you do about that? Well, in order to sort of move change, one of the things that will really float the boat in healthcare systems and politically are economics. And if you can link economic prosperity, or rather diminished economic cost is another way of looking at it, with good social equity and environmental protection, politicians will love you. They will think you're just the best thing ever. And it's really important to think of that. It's also an important framework to begin the conversation. There is no doubt if you want to effect change in terms of ecological change from a policy perspective, and you want to talk to Treasury, you start to talk to them about what adaptation and mitigation within our systems will do to save them money. If it has a nice spin-off of having not affecting social equity, well, they'll be quite pleased about that, and they'll be okay about environmental protection because that may save them some longer term costs. So it's about how you frame a message to the target group to affect change, and that's equally important in health because it's multi-layered. So we know two things. We know that healthcare has a huge impact on the environment because of its carbon footprint, and we know that healthcare costs. And if we apply sustainability measures of adaptation and mitigation and change in some way, then we could actually achieve three things. We could achieve some economic prosperity, social equity, and environmental protection. Really important. It's common in the literature and something that you should certainly be aware of. So that's just really putting it into another way, but if we look at the co-benefits of sustainability, and co-benefits is a really important commentary. So in other words, if you take one action, it has benefits for not just the individual or the system, but also for the environment. So it's about those co-benefits having things. I have my own way of thinking about it, and it's around people, planet, profit. And I think that if the co-benefit are for people, it's about co-benefits for planet if you change and adapt, and obviously it can affect profit. Now if you're going to talk to big industry, you absolutely have to talk to them about money and profit. People are not going to change their economic and business processes unless you tackle and come clean to them about profit. That's what they do. They're in business for profit. They're not there for the greater good. They're absolutely there for profit. That's how they survive as business. So in terms of sustainability in healthcare, and when you're dealing with, you are in healthcare always dealing with big industries. Healthcare is an industry in its own at the coalface of providing healthcare. Do you think of all the support services? Pharmaceuticals, an enormous, wealthy, profit-driven system. If you then say, actually, can we change this whole drug processing and how we deliver it and bring down the cost, and by the way, we're going to cut your profit margins hugely, not really sure they'll go for that easily. So you really have to, have all these commentaries and have an armory in place at a system level to start talking about that for system change. My view is that if you address sustainability, you widen out into addressing those other things. So you can tackle it from two ways, from a big system, but at an individual level as well. But there are always co-benefits to the individual, the system, people, and planet. So in terms of sustainable healthcare, David Pension and others have been looking at how they could break it down, and there's a very good book called Sustainable Healthcare, published by BMJ this year, by Schroeder, Thompson, Frith and Pension. It's online, and it is a fully online book as well. And of course, American systems that you can buy it from online also have it online. And they talk about these components of healthcare that we need to start thinking about? Does the patient experience their quality of life, the type of care? We know, for example, that people, you receive the most amount of care in your life in your last 2 years of life, if you're admitted to hospital in particular. So even if you're living at home, you're more likely to visit your GP and have much more regular health care in the last 2 years of your life. And in fact, if you're living with a chronic disease, it's actually the costs rise exponentially in the final year of your life. So, really important. The other thing is the whole patient experience once they enter into healthcare. If you've ever been in hospital, you will know there are lots of people who come and do lots of things to you, often without you ever having asked them to. And they'll take you off and they'll poke and prod you, and they put you inside big machines that go where beep and buzz, and find out whether you've got bits that work or don't inside you. They inject you. They do all sorts of things to you. And one of the big things that people are talking about in terms of quality of life as a patient and a patient experience is the amount of medical care we actually deliver, and do we need the medical care we actually engage in. And there's some significant work going on around the use of diagnostics, the overuse of testing of people when they're patients. And they've been looking very much around how much medicine is too much. And so there's some work emerging at the moment being led by people from Bond University around how much medicine is too much. And it's a whole campaign that the BMJ, which is the 4th highest impact medical journal, have taken on board, and are seeing this as an important drive. So there's a very committed group who you'd be surprised that are starting to debate whether there is too much medicine. Normally a quite conservative group, but they're quite keen to look at, are we over-investigating people? Just because we have things go whiz, bang, bleep, do we need them? Should we be using them? So they're actually questioning that whole level of health care. Of course, every machine that goes whiz, bang and bleep usually impacts on your ability to provide low carbon health care. They use a lot of energy, they're very energy dense. I read just before I came that if you have an MRI scan, it's the equivalent of driving in a car alone and drinking 4 bottles of 500ml bottles of bottled water, which is the equivalent of 4 bottles of bottled water is the equivalent to carbon emissions of 2,400 miles. And if you add onto that the amount of time you're in that, you basically multiply by 10. And that's the carbon emission every time you slide someone into one of those lovely machines. So, very difficult. Every time you slide someone into a machine, it costs money. Costs a lot of money. You may have that and it doesn't actually show anything. It was just done just in case. And that's part of the whole issue around, is there too much medicine? That's simplifying it, but it is an issue around that. Our energy consumption, our building use, the resilience of the building, how well the building, what it's been made from, are all really important things. And of course, every time we look at designing a new building, we hope that it will be solar passive, that we won't have to use too much energy. And where we place it, there is an increasing movement in healthcare about should we be building hospitals. I have to say that very quietly, given we're about to build one here on campus, but within these 4 walls, there is an increasing discussion as to whether to deliver healthcare at hospital for many conditions is the place to do it. Because we tend to over-test, we tend to over-create dependency, we often affect the quality of life. One of the big areas that we tackle a lot in healthcare is procurement and resource management. Procurement's about all the services you get, it's about where you source your food from, your supplies from, how far they travel. And here in Australia we have enormously long procurement chains. And of course most healthcare systems, private and public, gave up cooking their own food and of course now bring in airline style food, which comes cook chill in long distances. Again, hugely energy dense. Drugs and devices, huge energy use, both in provision. How people get to hospitals, all of us travelling, patients, visitors and staff, you can put that for any public building, university or anything. But all our travel affects it. And that again affects quality of life. So it's this cycle of the whole things that are energy dense, part of the things that we have to think about. We don't have to really worry in the sense that this is all new, you know, we've got to start from the beginning, we can learn from elsewhere. And there's distinct policy levers. Policies are very important when you're, especially in a public system, because government will decide and enact things that become legislation and policy falls from that. In the UK, 2008 was when they decided that healthcare costs were too great in the NHS and that the carbon footprint was unsustainable. They enacted legislation, but they also developed the sustainability unit. So they actually not only did something about it in terms of legislation, but they also put in place a mechanism that would support the NHS to help facilitate change. In Wales, it's one of the few countries with a statutory duty to pursue sustainable development, not just in healthcare, but across the board. So whether you're building a new house, railway station, or anything of any sort, you have to be sustainable in your development. And I've spoken about the Sustainability Development Unit under David Pension, and they were set up to tackle the NHS carbon footprint. Predominantly they were told to bring down costs. That was the key thing that they were told to do. That was, if you like, one of their measures of success. The other measure was about engagement of all the health system people. And they tackled initially procurement because they saw that as a very tangible way. And I have to say that when I was in Cambridge, it was incredible. The procurement people were really active. They were trying to outdo one another. I mean, they were almost, you know, they were growing veggies in the front lawn of the hospital, and you know, they were really tackling it with real passion, and it was incredible to see. But that very tangible way, there are things we can do, starts to affect change, not only being policy driven and legislation driven, but also starts to affect the mindset, because systems are driven by targets and what you achieve. If you implement them, people had to try and work towards them. The French have a legal framework on sustainable public procurement, and they really, as you might gather, the French revolted quite literally against hospital food about 5 years ago. And they said, you know, no, we're not having that. And basically, they looked at the quality of food, and they started their procurement change not from the basis of saving money or carbon footprint, but about the quality of food, which I thought was terribly French, really. And that supporting the big lobby there in France was actually the agriculture lobby. French farmers are an incredibly powerful lobby group. They were very worried that French produce was going elsewhere, especially when they found out that they were importing meat. The majority of meat coming into France for hospital food and other food was actually coming from Eastern Europe. And the French farmers at that time were having difficulties selling their own produce. So they lobbied very clearly that we have to change our procurement system because this is affecting us internally. And so they became very active in that. And in doing so, part of what they say is that any food for public hospitals in France should come within a 100-mile radius. And what they found, and there's quite a lot of literature around this, that they found that, of course, you get different foods now throughout the French regional system depending on your regionality, because obviously if you live in the Mediterranean part of France, your diet will be, of course, lots of tomatoes and eggplants and so forth. But if you live in the north, it's much more cold Western European. But they've changed it significantly. Sustainable fish farming, of course, on the east coast of France has changed significantly and has increased production. So they have, through their sustainable procurement for public services, have seen an increase in profit for their farmers who are the producers. And importantly, they don't get the same number of complaints from French people in hospital about the quality of food. And they've noticed that people actually will sit up and go, wow, this is nice, this is enjoyable, as opposed to having that slightly grey-brown sludge that you often get. So, quite different. So, you know, that kind of thing can really impact on it. In the US, after Hurricane Katrina, and as you know, their natural disasters of late have been fairly significant, they've taken a slightly different tack to healthcare and climate change. They're much more around how we can start to look at this from managing, preparing people against these types of disasters. And that's fairly significant in the US that they've taken that step, and it is a real lead on that. And of course, here in Australia, we did have a legislative lever in place. We still have it at the moment. Not sure how long it's going to be there in its current state. And we shouldn't, whatever you may think of what the lever was there to do, it is there for a purpose, and it's one that you can then hang off policy, you can hang off actions. It gives, if you like, legitimacy to how you want to operate. So I'll leave it there. I won't become too political about that. So in terms of sustainability, it's my belief as someone who's old and grey about healthcare, but it's really around that, for me, sustainability is the heart of both clinical and healthcare practice. Whether you're the cleaner, you should be looking at how you clean, what you clean with, or whether you're the doctor, how you diagnose, how you treat, what you treat with. All of it is around that. And for me, it's around these 4 principles. It's about prevention and health promotion. Having a public health background, I have a very strong view about these things. And yet, politically, we know that if there's one area that will be cut, and we're seeing that the wobbliness of the prevention agency at present, whether it will survive this recent review, we don't know. But that says something clearly about our view collectively about how we value prevention. It really does. You know, if we're going to get rid of it, what does it say about how we as a society value prevention and the promotion of good health? And I would add well-being at that point. That we need to educate patients in a health imperative. That we should have lean service delivery, and that's around cutting out the stuff we don't need, and that can often be about tackling some very entrenched views around the system. And that we should always be low carbon, that we should have modes of treatment and medical technologies with a lower environmental impact, and buildings, and where we work and how we work. 4 key principles. I actually think it's about quality and quality of care, and my driver, if you like, is around safety, and that we should do no further harm. And I think it's around no further harm to patient, place, and planet. So it's very much around what can we do that is safe and does no harm. What's effective? We do have evidence-based practice. However, we know that only about 20% of clinicians practice using evidence-based practice, and that's a good stab at it. interestingly, in the UK, they've just brought in targets where if you cannot demonstrate that at least 80% of your practice is evidence-based, then you lose 20% of your funding. And that includes within GPs. So they're expecting that people will use evidence that is shows about treatment modalities and so forth. That we should be patient-centred and patient-led services. And yet we are a professionally dominated system. Professionals dominate it, professionals lead the system. And David Pension's very clear about having patients on top and professionals on tap. At the moment it's probably the other way around. But it should be timely, that we should reduce the delay to care. We know about waiting lists, we know about getting access. If any of you live in rural areas or away from the coastal edges here, you will know the difficulty of getting into a GP. So access, timely care, how can we reduce the delay? Should be efficient, there's nothing wrong. People often think efficiency and efficient care is a bit of a dirty word. It's not really. We shouldn't spend money where we don't need to. We don't need to always do what we've always done, because it might not be the right thing. So we need to really reflect on that. We should be equitable, and that's around equitable of access, equitable about provision. And we should be able to deliver the care within existing or indeed fewer resources. So that's a major shift, because every time you say in healthcare, we need to do this, oh, we need more people, or we need more things, we need more space. So changing is quite different. So what are some of the things I think that we need to put in? Access, instant help online. We're seeing that happening more. And I think we'll see increasing amounts of that. We need to lower health inequalities. We have very good examples of health inequalities, and those, I'm sure you know, both you can be in a rural community, you have a greater propensity for health inequality. But you should be able to have care close to home, and perhaps in home as opposed to in hospital. But in the future, we'd like to see hospital admissions being rare, and there's a group of people who are talking about small hospitals where you go in for immediate, high-level care, stay there for a very short time, and then move out into community and home for care. And saying that many of our hospital buildings could be turned into, different use in the longer term. That our buildings are in tune with the environment, using almost no carbon. That we should enable a good death, and we should have the conversation about a good death. If you remember, I spoke about that your last 2 years of life are liable to be the times that you use most health care. This is not a sort of solid green or Orwellian view of life. This is about saying, can we have that community discussion and conversation about a good death and how people choose to die? Because death has become, in some parts of medicine, the ultimate failure, and the continual search for cure and intervention. A system where we can recycle, reuse and minimize waste. I was at a conference which was talking about recycling in hospitals, and it's quite hard to actually encourage people to do it. But they were looking at the drip bags. When you see people on drip and it's a plastic bag with the tubing, if you cut off the end about that much and recycle the bag and the tubing, often by Baxter's I have to say, and you put it in a separate bin and you can send it off, and there are people at the Vinyl Council who can melt it down, and apparently all plastics have different melting levels, that's as far as I'm going with that. But you can melt it down, and they're now taking that, melting it down, and they're producing carpeting from the intravenous tubes for aged care homes. and they're low carbon, it's recycling, and it seems very quite apt they're recycling it in that way. But they're finding it's intensely difficult to get hospitals to recycle it. Yet the number of drip bags that they would use in an acute hospital on a daily basis would be huge. But it's getting people to do it. But any form of service delivery that we do takes into not just the immediate now within this political cycle, but takes into long-term costs. Long-term costs in terms of the community, the individual, the system and planet. That we all promote some form of healthy living, and that well-being is the key. And that, well-being, that you have exposure not just to feeling well, but you have a sense of control over life, that you can be, if you have to become a patient, that you can feel that you're the patient as a patient on top, and that the professionals are on tap to you. That's also about control. It's also around your sense of being as well. So if you think about that in terms of a healthcare system, it's a different view to the type of healthcare system that we walk into. Anyone been admitted to hospital recently? How did it feel? Yeah?
Yeah. Well, I felt exposed.
Yeah? You certainly don't
Left
feel
my
on top,
dignity at
do
the
you?
door.
Yeah? You don't feel on top, do you?
No.
And all these people who rarely introduce themselves appear and do things to you. It's quite a different experience. And you're trying to ask questions, and not now because we're walking. It's a really different system. So your sense of well-being, your sense of self is eroded quite quickly in that environment. And that's about partly systems, but it's also about professional dominance as well. So there are subtle undercurrents around all of this. All of this requires change. And it is all about engaging people in that change. And part of that is the really difficult part, because many of us don't want to give up our nice things that we have. There is one other thing now. In the past you'd have said, well, health professionals, in terms of big societal change, Jon Snow, yay, all of those sort of people have done enormous things in terms of changing both legislation, understanding of our world, have been real leaders in terms of that. Yet some work that Kate Charlesworth and others did said, well, why aren't health professionals out there, really manning the barricades and really protesting about sustainability? And she found that they were overly rational and critical of new evidence and said, oh, well, that's just that. Study size wasn't big enough. There are flaws in it. Or they were too busy delivering care. They were actually too busy just getting through the grind of daily work. That the system requires them, and they themselves become, as part of their behaviour, reactive to demand. And if you've ever worked in health, you will understand what that means. It means you react to the moment, what's in front of you there and then. They are focused on the immediate needs of the individual rather than the long-term view of society. I thought this one was really interesting, that they already have a sense of doing something for the greater good by working in health. So why do we have to do any more? Somebody else can do that. And there was a very strong sense of change fatigue. And again, if you've worked in a healthcare system, continuous reform, continuous change is quite normal. So it looks from that to engage some health professionals, perhaps the majority, is going to be hard work, because they already think that they're doing enough, don't have enough time. Luckily, there are little gleaming lights, and across Australia there are quite a few people who are working on it. The Victorian healthcare system probably has the best example of sustainability in terms of building and procurement. New South Wales is doing a lot around procurement, The Northern Territory is doing a lot about sustainable living and promoting well-being, as is Western Australia, particularly in a lot of the work they're doing in the Kimberley region. And they're looking about being more innovative in their use of technology to deliver care in home, using often assistants and others that they train at home that can support people through the illness. So changing systems is happening, and there are glimmers of hope. The problem is, in our federated system, there is no consistency, and it is really rather luck where you might end up. So there is still an inequality issue around that. I bring you back to this. These are all things we have to tackle, and more, but these are some of the big ones. And the things I didn't put in the middle are legislation, policy, power structures, because they're equally important in terms of change for sustainability. What do I think? I think we need to engage health professionals, health systems, politicians, communities. I think we need to debate. We need to connect with one another. We're a pretty disengaged society, and ultimately to enable transformation. Why? Because I think we actually need to talk to people about expectations about healthcare. We still have a view that healthcare means you go on and on forever. We only have to look at the boom in the cosmetic surgery end of things, that we're all meant to be looking 19 or possibly 17, and everything needs to be, shuffled around, squirted and pulled out and all sorts of things. So we have still a view around where, what do we expect from healthcare? What are reasonable expectations for longer term survival? And that's a community discussion we actually need to start having. And we may start to have conversations about patient control, about how you can adapt, how you can self-manage to live with chronic illness in a way that enhances your well-being. But we need to have those discussions. We cannot have the view and enable the view that healthcare still has a silver bullet approach, that there's bound to be a pill that will cure you, there's bound to be a pill that you can take that will keep you going. We actually have to recognise, all of us, that there are things we have to do in terms of how we engage and how we also transform ourselves. We need to think about the models of practice within our systems. How do we practice? How do we deliver care? How often do we question whether we're doing harm or not? How often do we question ourselves around that? And how can we ensure we're doing no further harm? How can we have better care, but perhaps not more care? I'm really keen to have a high quality healthcare system there if I ever need it. But I don't want to be poked and prodded about things that I might have, or could have had. I want to know that my care is evidence-based. I want to know why things are being done. That's also about educating our community about what is appropriate and what they should expect and ask. How can we engage and how can we move towards a collective responsibility for a sustainable healthcare system? Because it isn't just a system approach within healthcare, but it's a community-based approach. Because community drives the expectations of what the healthcare system will deliver. So actually a lot of this is around having the conversation with the wider community about our collective responsibility to drive for well-being. And I think that's about saying, so what can we expect? Can we adapt? How can we mitigate? How can we manage? All of us. Of course, we need to be underpinned by research, support it. We need to understand how people will engage with sustainability. We need to enable seeing beyond the individual to the community, and I would say the planet. That's a hard thing to do. But we can roll out David Attenborough and show what's happening to rare species. perhaps we need to do a documentary about human beings as being the next endangered species. That might help. How do we use evidence-based practice in that? What policy do we have? All of these things are intermeshed in the whole process. It's about engaging, debating, connecting, and transforming is the only way we will drive towards sustainability. There are key things we can pick out and tackle, and we should be tackling, and people are. So it's not all doom and gloom, but there's a lot more to do. I think that health services can actually lead and health practitioners can lead. Because there are multiple co-benefits of improved health, improved societal finance, reputation, reducing environmental impact, and increased community engagement. And I think all of that requires a research agenda to capture existing sustainable action and what we can do into the future to affect people, planet, and profit. And just to wind up, it's going to be difficult to achieve without leadership and innovation, engaging health systems and professionals, and also communities. It's going to be very hard unless we engage our communities. But the expectations of what is achievable and deliverable in terms of healthcare is equally important. Because we have to be aware that we live in a time of constant change, and many people will just see this as something else, as change for the sake of change. So I'm going to finish there because I've just sort of thrown a whole lot of stuff at you, and it's pre-lunch, and I know that you might have some questions. And I hope that I've managed to make you think just a little bit. Thanks. I'm happy to take any questions if you have any.
Yeah, Maggie, I'm really pleased that last statement you put up, because I was thinking you can't really start at the health system level because it is a systemic problem. And I think Australia has a number of things that they're doing already, and I think you alluded to them in some of those around the States, like telemedicine is, you know, the online phone support, the counselling. So that's one way of keeping people in their homes and not having to travel and get the advice and support they need.
Except there is no blanket coverage.
No,
it really
yeah.
depends where you are. So in some bizarre ways, we're actually still increasing inequality because you may not have access to those. So
Some doctors won't do it because they don't get paid to do it.
Yeah, and that's another issue
Yeah.
in the sense of the acceptability of some of the things. But the fact is, we start to do some of these things, but they're in pockets.
Yeah.
And like procurement's a big one, because that's one of the issues I've looked at as well. And all hospitals, health services need bandages and, you know, your basic medicines and things. But apparently what happens is each individual health service or hospital has to do their own procurement. And so therefore the companies have the monopoly of who they'll charge and what they'll charge. Whereas if they do it in a systems wide, they've got far more power to then negotiate with the big companies to then get a deal, be it statewide or national. But it's not being done. It's
They do in New South Wales. It is a state-based procurement system. However, that's only that's fine up until the point of who's actually leading into the procurement system.
Yes.
And the people who order things that are procured are the health professionals, and they are incredibly difficult to tackle around some of the items they may procure. And
Yes.
in no way am I picking on doctors and nurses, because they do have personal preferences, and they're often because it's what they've always used, or it happens to be the particular hip joint that you actually can only get flown out from Davos in Switzerland from the supplier. And yes, it may cost 75,000 per implant, but that's the only one I'm going to use. And so, you know, there is the health professionals, even with a state-based procurement system where they do a lot of that at a state-based level. I was party to some of the discussions around when they were trying to refine the list, you know, a hip joint, well, we'll have 3 of those, you know. And I cannot tell you the amount of hours I spent in meetings discussing why we couldn't possibly just have 3 hip joints on the procurement list. We needed to have at least, and it was over 300, because everyone had different preferences. They eventually got it down to 40, which, you know, it was still incredibly difficult. So personal choice, what people use, isn't always as easy, even with the state-based procurement system.
Maggie, where's the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare based? Was that at the
University of Cambridge.
Yeah.
Still there.
Just general comment. When I started, I just started a doctorate this year, and so I did what I call a fishing expedition. I consulted Dr. Google and looked at, well, I went fishing for examples of sustainability in healthcare.
Yeah.
That was my case study. And so I looked specifically for organisations that had sustainable development or sustainability in their principles or values or policy statements. And there weren't that many. So I came up with quite a few in Victoria, because
Yep.
Victoria has actually got a sustainable health unit.
Yes, they have.
But they're
There's
coming
2
from,
people in it.
yeah, I know. And they've got like a quality framework
Yeah.
that's based on
They
greening
have
hospitals. And it's economic driven. It's
Yeah.
about the bottom line.
Yeah.
It's not the triple bottom line, it's the economic
Yeah.
bottom line about waste management, about energy use, switching the light off, turning the tap off, that kind of thing. So it doesn't come from an ecological perspective. So I thought, well, surely somebody else is doing something else. But in community health in Victoria, there's a few community health services that have been
Yeah.
doing small types of things with communities, a bit like what we've seen today, you know, with these examples about what they're doing in the community level. Again, it's not, that's the social side, it doesn't connect
Yeah.
to the whole triple bottom line. Then in the UK, with the sustainable NHS unit, they've got quite a lot of things going on there, much more active. Like the University College of London, they've actually engaged the local community, and the community is engaged in this procurement process as well. So they've actually got local businesses now providing procurement trains and things for them. So it can be done, but it takes like the top level leadership to actually, well, legislate, but actually start thinking about
Trevor
it.
Roper, who drives that in London, was one of the deputy chief executive for NHS England. So he then went back to University College Hospitals Group in London and put in the procurement staff. And in the space of 3 years, they have saved £47.2 million solely in their procurement.
Yeah.
And so, of course, they've been talking about that, which has engaged most of the other London hospitals in a big way.
And the money that they save, they put into funding those positions.
Yes, they do.
That's how they got it.
They all, well, actually, they do,
Yeah.
but they put most of it back into patient care. And what they're doing is how they can, they're trying to manage their demand into healthcare. And so what they're actually trying to do is stop people getting to the hospital door.
Gary Egger's done some interesting work about the O word and the link for obesity and how, as an economist,
Yeah.
Ross Gittins wrote a paper about links to how obesity is actually good for our GDP because
Yeah.
all this money is being spent on, and until we have that, you know, holistic view and triple bottom line,
Yeah.
that will just perpetuate.
Yeah.
I was just going to bring back to the point of how you're saying there's a lot of waste, especially with, I noticed, like, you know, with prostate checks and breast checks, that they're actually finding more cancer. And if you tell a person they've got cancer, even though it's not aggressive and it can be managed, they want the best treatment right there and then, even though it's not economically viable. So have we done ourselves, by trying to do something good, have we kicked ourselves to that side, really? And maybe should have more education in that.
In some ways, you know, there's no doubt that some of the work that we've done, we have huge expectations about what our health system can deliver. And we expect the most technologically advanced, we expect you know, the medication that we can take 3 times a day to help control it, whatever it is. We have expectations of that. Those are things that we can do. And actually, you know, we all know, for example, if you take one pill, you often have to take another one to counteract the effects of the one you were taking. But maybe if you just walk 30 minutes a day, that might help. You know, there's a whole range of things around. But, you know, human beings are really complex creatures, and they really like the easiest option. And that's often what people will do, and we have an expectation of that. We have an expectation that we have a highly curative illness service. That's one of our quite core views. You know, it's not about prevention. If we could prevent and put money and invest into prevention, it would, I believe, dramatically change our overall community well-being. But we don't. You know, prevention gets the smallest amount in the health budget. And trust me, every time we restructure in a health system, I can tell you which part gets cut first.
Now I'm thinking that there's a lot of, with this slide, the emphasis is on community education, and I think you're right in the sense
In
that
one part, it's only part of a puzzle.
But, I mean, as with the fossil fuel industry, I mean, the same kind of
Yep.
elements come into play
Yep.
there.
It's intensely complex, but I believe that we actually have to start having those discussions. You know, we know that, you know, peak oil is not going to last forever. You know, we know there's a big issue with oil production. And that's why we're starting to see people doing all sorts of things with coal and other things, and wanting to frack systems and stuff. But, you know, we actually have to start having that conversation amongst ourselves about, you know, it's not going to last forever. What else? How are we going to adapt? We're not having that part of adaptation.
Just leading on from that, I'm just thinking about Maruya Hospital. Do you think that they could go back to cooking in the kitchen? Like, would they be supported to do that?
Yes, it's probably.
Maria Hospital for one, haven't you, Maggie? Lucky you.
That's why I asked.
Yeah, but their kitchens are still able to do that. And most small regional hospitals, very few of the kitchens were ever ripped out because it was too expensive to rip them out. So most of them are still there. There's nothing, you know, and patients will lament, and they do, about the days of when things were cooked, because they would often, you know, have rather pleasant aromas which stimulate appetite and all of those things, as opposed to getting the airplane box, which, you know, you struggle to try and open it even if you're fairly strong, to be met with something that you often can't recognise. You know, it's not going to encourage you to have anything to eat.
And highly packaged.
Yeah, it's processed.
I was just on that subject. Nutrition, isn't nutrition a big part of getting people better?
Yes,
So
of
should
course.
we be providing them with, you know, healthy nutrition?
But it's the argument. They will say that yes, the food still does meet the basic nutritional requirement. But then, you know, you actually could eat a handful of dog food, dry dog food, and that would probably do the same. And you could also get a shiny nose and a waggy tail and great hair and nails. But, you know, we're probably unlikely to want to sit and crunch our way through, you know, a handful of Bonio biscuits. But it is.
If the patient sees something nice, like
Absolutely.
you can help.
But it was thought to be too expensive, and that's part of the history. It was thought to be too expensive to have multiple kitchens. You have a centralised procurement system whereby you have a centralised, most meals, for example, in New South Wales come from central Sydney. They come from the same place that the Qantas meals are cooked, except they're done in a different line, and are much less expensive than the Qantas meals. And, you know, then are chilled and are then ferried across New South Wales.
To Meals on Wheels, to prisons.
Prisons, yes.
It's much cheaper.
Much
So it becomes
cheaper.
a trade-off. Do we outsource our food production in order to buy another CAT scan machine and another operating theatre and another few renal units? And yeah, that's the sort of decision making hospitals are making all the time. Bryony, did you have one?
I just had a comment about how Maggie was saying that people often choose treatment over prevention. But I'm often surprised by how even when we're given what are actually really amazing treatment options, we're very often not complying with what goes with those treatment
Yeah.
options. You're told that you can take a tablet a day for your cholesterol levels, and the amount that people are uncompliant with their medications is quite huge.
Yeah.
People get knee reconstructions and are told to stay off them for however long, and they're like, yeah, but I can't ride my bike, I'm just going to do it anyway. All these things like that. And we just
Part of our complexity as human beings. We shouldn't negate that complexity. Taking antibiotics is probably the best example of that. People often don't finish course of antibiotics, hence our huge issue with antibiotic resistance. And we're now searching for the next best antibiotic because all of them no longer seem to be effective. So, we didn't adapt, we don't mitigate. It's still those issues.
There are lots of other issues, aren't there, around that wastage
Yeah.
of drugs and equipments and so on.
Or keeping in the
hospitals.
cupboard and just in case you might need them in 15 years' time.
Yeah, I can't tell you how. Just following up on the food one, I mean, it seems to me that the problem is the lack of joined up thinking. Because if we were thinking about healthcare, social welfare, education, sustainability all together, and transport issues, then we would be having the local hospital used as
Or no hospital.
or no hospital, used as a training ground
Yeah.
for the young people who want to go into the food industry and who are doing a course at the local TAFE to prepare the food there, to grow the food that they can grow for them. And you would then be getting high quality meals, and you wouldn't be chucking those people off to other centres to go for their training. It would all be locally based. And it can be done, but at the high level, because we work in a silo system, the education department doesn't want to fund anything that's actually going to benefit the health department, and vice versa. And so they all have their own budgets.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And
Intensely complex systems.
yeah.
And intensely complex negotiations.
Yeah.
But there is a point at which we have to think about all of us. How can we adapt and mitigate? Is it instance for something else for other people to do is the other thing.
Yeah, there's talk of health professionals not being trained clinically enough to develop those skills, so that's why there's this reliance on diagnostic tools. And also there's the professional indemnity, there's that fear if I don't do it and something goes wrong. So there's those two components, because part of the training is trying to get the practice and getting those openings in hospitals and health settings to develop those skills is a bit of a problem in the training as well.
Has anyone ever actually tried not providing that solution of the healthcare system that we have? Anyway, because
You mean
we are
taking it away?
incredibly lazy, and I know there'd be huge ethical problems with that. But
I'm not sure how you could do that, Kate, unless we
Well,
park
no.
people on the little island. So you
I
can't
don't
have any
mean,
of that.
just completely say
Yeah.
that's it, no more health. But if you were to take away such a good solution, people think, oh, if I get sick, I'm going to the doctor. It doesn't matter if I get high cholesterol, if I go to McDonald's every day for the rest of
Yeah.
my life. If you were to take that away, and then sort of start feeding back, like you put the expectation back on the people instead of letting them put the expectation on the health system.
I mean, ethically that would be incredibly difficult. We
Oh,
do
yeah.
take away our healthcare systems, of course, from people, but it doesn't affect their behaviour very much. So,
America's a really good example where you can't really, it's a market-based system, you can't afford it, but the health problems are still definitely there and very prevalent.
and that's part of inequality. And as I say, it's not just, health systems are just a little part of this jigsaw. And what I've tried to show, that even trying to tackle within a health system involves multiple layers of complexity. And at the end of the day, a lot of this still revolves around individual and collective behaviour and willingness to change. And the one thing that human beings aren't terribly thrilled with is changing. So it's going to be difficult. We can put out the messages about, Fine says that this is the greatest threat to our species. I take that kind of seriously as a mother of a 17-year-old. Wonder what will happen in terms of where he lives. I mean, he's into wind power anyway, 'cause he sails. So, but it does have major impact in terms of what will his life look like? What will his children, if he has any, not yet, please, what will that mean? What will it mean for future generations? That perhaps we can't just live in the now. We are a generation, and generations, we're incredibly fortunate. We have lots of things that our forebears didn't have, but we do live in the here and now and are consumers. And that's what we all do.